Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this giant vac leaf blower. I fixed one of these recently and actually wasn't planning on fixing another at least until next season. That said though, this one I couldn't pass up. Even though leaf season's over, it was just too good of a deal. I found it on Facebook Marketplace. The guy was giving it away. Now, free stuff usually comes at a price. And this one I don't think is going to be an exception because according to the listing, the seller was trying to start it when it actually caught fire. So if we look over here, you can see some of the damage. I melted this plastic down here, kind of charred the fuel valve as well as this cable. And surprisingly, the tank still has fuel in it. So yeah, this could have gone very wrong. This thing could have for sure burnt to the ground. So I guess the question in my mind is, how did this thing catch on fire? I would expect it potentially to do so in the airbox or the exhaust, but in this case, it actually ignited over here. So I'm thinking likely some fuel was spilled when he was filling the tank, and the ignition system actually has a kill wire for the primary under here, which can spark. So I'm thinking that was the source of ignition. The engine was cold at the time. So really, spark is the only way that could have ignited. And the fact that the fuel is still on and the tank is still full tells me that likely user error may have been involved. Now, fixing this stuff shouldn't be a big deal, but I think we do have bigger problems here. I did pull the engine over and it does rotate. I hear the piston going up and down, but I don't think I feel much of anything for compression. So, I think we need to focus in on that. Make sure that the core of the machine is good. But before I do that, let's drain the tank. Let's get all the charred pieces out of the way, and then we'll dig into the engine. Make sure it's good. So the fuel that's in here is likely still good. But for unknown fuel, I like to pump it into clear bottles. That way I can see kind of the color, see if there's any water, any debris. And regardless, I will run this through a coffee filter just to make sure it's clean. But in this case, it actually looks to be fairly fresh fuel. So this can be reused. Now to get this piece off, you're supposed to turn the valve to the off position, and surprisingly it turned. Looks like we've got some burnt leaves that came out of there. So we'll just get that throttle cable disconnected. And this should just pull forward. But I think that deformed fuel valve is going to give us a little bit of trouble. So I might actually need to cut the plastic off so that we can get this through. This handle's kind of in the way, so we'll just take it off for now. With the cable disconnected, there's really nothing holding it on other than these two bolts. really stuck. Yeah, we'll fix that later. Usually getting the tank off is a pretty easy thing to do. You just have 2 bolts to remove right there, and then you have 2 more on the back side. But because of the way that it is, we can't actually access the back side. So likely we are going to have to remove the blower and actually remove the engine from the frame. But I'm thinking before we resort to that, let's remove the engine mounting bolts. Potentially we can slide it back just a bit, and that might be enough. I don't know. We got teeny tiny bit of space there, but I'm thinking even if I can get them out, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get them back in. So unfortunately, I think we need to pull the blower. In theory, this should be pretty easy to get out. You just remove these 3 bolts, and then you use these 2 threaded holes to send some bolts in, which essentially just push against the fan, which pulls this bushing out, and that frees up everything. That said, though, last time I tried it, all I did was strip out those 2 holes. So hopefully this time it goes a little better. Be really nice if it was the same bolt, but that would be too easy. Pretty sure that should be a 5/16, 18 threads per inch, but it's kind of rusted up, so I'm going to use a tap to just chase the threads. Well, besides the tank and this plastic piece, the rest of the machine actually fared pretty well. The airbox does not have any fire-related damage. The oil fill tube in equally good condition. And if you look right here, this is underneath where the tank was. You can see we do have burnt leaves and some evidence of heat or fire under the tank. So I think that kind of backs up my belief is that someone spilled gas, it went under the tank, and if you're pulling the engine over and you move this throttle to off, there is actually a contact right there where it grounds out the primary coil. And you can actually see a wire right there. So that can spark. And based on the evidence here, I'm thinking that was the ignition source. Anyway, let's get the plug pulled out. I want to get the compression tester in there and see if we have any compression. It's kind of interesting. The tip of the spark plug, it kind of looks like there's gel bridging the gap between the ground strap and the electrode. So I haven't seen that before, but like that, it's probably not going to spark. That said, though, I don't think spark is the issue, clearly. So let's get the compression tester in there and see if we have any. This engine, it should have a decompression system. So with that in play, 50, maybe 60 PSI, that's the best we should see. In this case, based on pulling it over earlier, I'm thinking it's going to be a lot closer to 0. And yeah, that needle did not move, so we are at 0 PSI. So I'm thinking we should check the valves next. 0 compression, that's usually a sign of a valve problem. Either a valve is stuck or one of them is at 0 clearance. And there's one way up here, which you can't really get a straight shot on. That's not good. Water just dripped out. Thankfully, I don't see much in the way of rust. But, yeah, I'm not sure why there's water in there. It makes me wonder what's in the bottom end. Anyway, let me rotate the engine. Just make sure we see both of these rockers move. And then I'm going to position the engine at top dead center. We'll check the clearance, see if one of the valves is tight. So we're just a little bit past top dead center. The intake seems kind of tight. Let's start with the 3000s. And unfortunately it fits, so we do have clearance on both valves. Fits pretty loose on the exhaust. So yeah, valve clearance It's not the problem. Well, given the lack of compression and the fact that some water dripped out of the valve cover, and if you look closely at the valve springs, you can see there is a little bit of surface rust, especially on the exhaust valve. So that tells me there is water in the engine. So I'm thinking we should probably drain the oil next and just see what we're dealing with. So let's see if it has oil to start with. Yeah, it's got oil. Seems a little watery though. Or potentially fuel. Yeah, actually smells a lot like stale fuel. So that is better than water. So let's get the plug out and just make sure. Well, thankfully there was no water inside the engine, just oil mixed with fuel. And thankfully the oil came out clean. There is really no metallic in there. So, despite the lack of compression, I'd say this engine has a good chance of coming back. I'm going to get the airbox out of the way and do a leak down test, or at least use the leak down tester to pressurize the cylinder. We're still at top dead center. The valves should be closed, but we know we're leaking. So if we pressurize it, we can check the exhaust, the intake, and the crankcase to see where the pressure is going. So we'll just add a bit of pressure. And you can see we're not actually retaining any of the pressure. So we do have 100% leak down. Nothing coming from the exhaust. Surprisingly, nothing from the intake. I still get the plug out on the other side from draining the oil. Let me check that. And no pressure there either. So it actually sounds like it's leaking somewhere up by the head. So potentially we have a blown head gasket. To get access to the head, we're going to have to kind of remove everything that's attached to it, like the exhaust, the carburetor, the airbox. But it's a little bit more involved on this machine than most, because to get the cooling tin off, it looks like we actually have to remove this bracket, and we can't remove the bracket until we remove the governor arms. So yeah, all this stuff has to come out to get access to that head. So we are free, except for the governor rod. It's still connected to the carb, so we do need to pull the carb before we can get this tray off. We've just got one bolt on the far side here, so I'm going to get that out. You know, potentially we can fish this piece out without removing the blower housing and the exhaust, but I think ultimately those are going to have to be removed. Yeah, let's get the exhaust off. What do you think the odds are of these coming out? I'd say pretty good. So that right there is part of the head gasket. How it blew out like that, I don't know. But I am gonna go out on a limb here and say that that is the leak. So I'm gonna get the leak down tester back on. We will pressurize the cylinder and look for a leak. And just on a side note, now that I'm in here a little deeper, I can see there was a fire in here as well. You can see it's a little bit scorched right there. The kill wire looks like it's a little charred. And this wire right here that goes to the spark plug, it's damaged as well. So based on that and what happened here, I'm kind of changing my mind as far as what may have happened to this machine. You know, I'm thinking he was trying to start it, it wouldn't start, and likely sprayed a ton of ether into the engine, and likely it just detonated, causing the head gasket to do what it did. I don't know. This one, it's kind of an odd one. Yeah, really, I don't even need to do a leak down test. You can just see the gap right here and the evidence right there. That said, though, we're here. We might as well pressurize it. We'll spray some soapy water in there and just see how bad it's blown out. So I probably shouldn't have sprayed that because now that water is going in the engine. But you can see, just putting 25 PSI in, it just blew that soapy water right out of there. So yeah, that is a pretty big breach in that head gasket. So let's keep going. We need to get the blower housing off and just see what the damage is behind there. And I do want to pull the head and just make sure that the head gasket is the only problem. Yeah, it just keeps getting worse. The fan melted. So we need a new fan. I would say we do need a new ignition coil based on the fact that this is just falling apart. We do need a new kill wire, obviously a new head gasket, new fuel tank, and the piece of plastic that wraps around. So the price of this repair is adding up quick. So I'm glad this was a free machine. Whoa. Well, no surprises, thankfully, in the cylinder. It looks pretty clean. Nothing's wrong with the piston. And the head actually is in pretty good shape. I was a little concerned that we could have some rust on the valves, but they actually look decent. Really, the big problem here is just this big chunk of head gasket that blew out. So if we fix that, we should get compression back, and then all we need to do is fix the fire damage. So remember way back in the beginning when I said free stuff is usually the most expensive? Well, this one, it is no exception. I was hoping we could get away with just a new tank, a new plastic piece, some new fuel line, and a new valve, and this thing would be ready to go. But as we just discovered, it's a lot more extensive than just that. So I made up a parts list, looked up all the part numbers, and if I want to fix this and make it 100% using brand new OEM parts to replace the ones that are broken, the price comes out to $337. And that does not include tax and shipping. So once you factor that in, it's even worse. So this blower, I don't think I could sell it for that much. So I went back to the list, crossed off a few things that we don't really need. Some other stuff, I went to eBay and found some used parts. And I also went to Amazon and found some aftermarket parts. So now if I order a mix of aftermarket, used, and brand new, the repair cost is now down to $122. So all that stuff's been ordered. It'll be here in a few days. While we wait for that, though, we do need to prep things for reassembly. And even before I do that, I think I'm going to dig into this carb because I am willing to bet the carb has a run issue, and that's what led to all of this. So let's get this opened up. We'll get it cleaned up, and then we'll move on. Actually, before we start cleaning things up, let's just finish the disassembly. We need to get this melted fan off. There's just a bolt on either side here, But to get the fan off, we actually need to pull the starter cup first. Might as well get the coil off too. Now, surprisingly, this kill wire, it's discontinued. So I think I do have some others, not quite the same. You know, but at the end of the day, it is just a wire with a connector, so we can make one if we need to. Just going to get this fuel line out of the way. It is going to be replaced anyway. Now, I did accidentally tip this, so some of the fuel did spill out. It did look pretty dark and smelled pretty bad. So, I'll try to catch what's left. Yeah. I would say this was the run issue. I can see a little bit of water, and it's very dark. And smells like varnish. Yeah, it's been in there for a while. So if you look at the fuel, you know, if you can see the bottom, there is a good water line down there. So like that, even if the carb was good, likely it wouldn't be able to run. You know, this stuff here, it is just old fuel, varnish. It's going to clean up real well. And the carb itself, definitely a clogged passage right over there. Needle is not stuck, although it does feel a little gummy. Let's see if we can get this pin out. Yep, it's coming. That's pretty much it. You know, this is a very simple carburetor. The emulsion tubes, they are not removable. So we'll clean those up the best we can. You know, I will hit it with a bit of carb cleaner. Although I have to be careful because this seat, it will swell up if I'm not careful. So we'll try to keep that dry. Same thing with this bowl gasket. Ideally, I would remove it. Although in this case, removing it might cause more damage than leaving it in place, but it is coming. Okay, good. So I'm just going to run through the passages. We'll check it and clean it with some carb spray, and then we'll soak it in the ultrasonic for 5 or 10 minutes, and I think we'll be in good shape. Surprisingly, the main jet was not clogged. Yeah, it's so nice, these older carbs. The brass is actually brass, and it cleans up really well. Carb cleaned up pretty well. And it should run the engine, I would think, halfway decent once the engine is capable. So we will get it back together and just set it aside for now. Yeah, we might need to get a new seat for this. See how the float isn't level? Yeah, it should be more like that. So that tells me that the seat is swollen, which is no big deal because I actually ordered a new seat. So we'll replace that when it arrives. For now, we'll just loosely get it back together. So we might as well keep going. We do have a bunch of oil over here, which I think just came from the fill tube. I don't think the oil seal is actually leaking. So I'm going to use a bit of WD-40 and a brush, and that'll take it right off. It's good enough. Doesn't need to be perfect. As soon as I bring it out and blow some leaves, it's going to be covered in dust anyway. So while I'm here, I am going to put oil back in the engine. Since we don't need to open it up, we might as well have it ready to go. According to a quick Google search, this should take 20 fluid ounces, which is about 600 milliliters. So I did take off the fill cap. Really, you just want to fill it until it's right up to the last thread. And it looks like Google was right. And really the last thing to deal with here is the head. So I'm going to take a second and just clean the valves up. Now, the springs, they're not that bad. You know, there is a bit of rust. I was going to just reuse them, potentially soak them in evaporust. But new springs, they're only $5 each. So I did splurge and get a new set. Anyway, we'll get the valves out. I do want to clean those up separately. And a little rust on the seat, so we will have to lap the valves in to clean that up. And that one is stuck. Huh. Well, that's not good. Yeah, just a little bit of surface rust on the stem. So I'm going to take some Scotch-Brite to this. We'll spin it in the drill, get all the rust off. And I think that should solve this issue. Let's just double check it now that it's clean. And yeah, moves a lot better once you get the rust out of there. So the valves are mostly done. I guess we do need to lap them, but I'm thinking before we do that, let's just clean up this carbon. You know, we'll clean the seats as well. There's some light surface rust, and then we'll lap the valves in. The valves actually cleaned up pretty well. You know, I was kind of worried when I saw the rust. I wasn't sure if there was going to be pitting underneath, but thankfully there wasn't. And the seats are in equally as good a shape. So the last check I like to do is to just put the valves in and with light pressure try to rotate the valves. You know, if they're seating well, they shouldn't rotate. And these are not rotating. So I think we're good. Well, it's a few days later, and all the parts I was waiting for, they have arrived. So let's start by getting the head back on the machine. I did get a couple new valve springs, which technically we don't need, but when I saw they were $5 each, I thought that was a no-brainer, especially given the rust on the ones in there. We also have a new valve stem seal and a new head gasket. So let's get this stuff installed. We'll get the head bolted on, the valve clearance set, and then move on to the rest of the stuff. So I'm going to start with the exhaust valve. I do have a towel under there just holding the valve up. It makes it easier to get the retainer off. Now the spring, it's not terrible. I actually did spray it with oil. It looks actually pretty good. But again, for $5, we're in here. We'll get a new spring on. And this is the old seal right here. It's good practice to replace these, and actually the oil seals too. I wasn't going to replace any of the seals just because, the cost involved, but this one didn't feel like it was fitting the valve very well. And I was also spraying carb cleaner in here to clean out the valve stem guide, and the cleaner can definitely cause damage to the rubber, which creates the seal on the stem. So thought it better to be safe than sorry. I just degreased the mating surfaces, and usually there are locating pins that I just kind of hang the head gasket on and bolt the head down. In this case, the locating pins that are on the head, so we will do it this way instead. And we have compression. It's amazing what a head gasket will do. I'm not sure if it matters, but the retainers, they were kind of pointing diagonal, this little notch right here. So I'm going to set those back to how they were. And then we have rotator caps, one for each valve. So get a little oil on it. Okay, there's one. I've got the engine set to top dead center, actually just a touch past, and the intake valve is very tight. The exhaust, pretty close to zero clearance. Now, as far as the valve specs go, I actually found differing information from different Briggs documents, so it's not completely clear. One document suggested 6 thousandths for the intake and 8 for the exhaust, and then another one said 5 for the intake and 10 for the exhaust, which 10, that is a lot for an overhead valve engine. If the clearance is too great, the push rod could fall out. Although it's not unusual to have a larger clearance over here. So I'm thinking, for the intake, I'm going to aim for 5, maybe 6. And the exhaust, I think 7 might be a good compromise between those two. So, yeah, the 5 obviously doesn't fit. So let's crack that bolt in the middle free, which will allow adjustment of the valves. That feels pretty good there at 5 thousandths. All right, that's locked in place. Well, in theory, that's it for the valves, but I'm going to double check. So the intake, well, let's try a 6. I mean, it fits, but it's super tight. 5 feels pretty good. And on the exhaust, an 8 also fits, but very tight. So, yeah, I'm happy with that. So let's get the valve cover back on. All right, so right there, that's the start of the compression stroke. Both valves are closed. So I'm just going to back it up a little bit to the bottom of the stroke, which is right about there. The valves should still be closed. And I'm going to fill the cylinder with rope to effectively lock it up. And once the engine's locked up, we can torque down the flywheel nut to spec. this on the floor. Get the coil on next. Now this is a clone coil. A lot of times they're not labeled which side is out. This one actually is, but technically you could install this either way. But if you install it upside down, likely it's not going to spark. Or if it does spark, it's going to be a weak spark, and it's going to spark at the wrong time. So make sure you don't put it on upside down. As far as the original wire goes, I mean, technically we might be able to get away with reusing it. Yeah, I really wanted to replace it, but they don't make this exact wire anymore for whatever reason. So, this one I would say is out. And I had planned on just using this wire. This actually came from another Briggs that ran out of oil and locked up. I was just going to cut the end off and attach this to the kill switch. The problem is this is stranded core, and the wire that's needed is a solid core. So I don't think this is going to work out. So instead, I'm just going to use this piece of solid core. Now, we're going to have to crimp an end onto it. And I guess the other thing that makes me a little nervous is that I don't know the heat rating on this insulation. So there is a chance it could melt off, in which case it'll ground the coil out. But I think we'll give it a try. Just adding a little bit more protection here where it goes through the block so that it doesn't chafe the wire and ground out. And same here, just for a little bit of extra protection. I did pick up a new plug, and it measures right at about 30 thousandths, so that is perfect. Well, we're at the point where we need to reset the calibration between the governor arm and the governor shaft. To do that, we need to install the carburetor. But I don't want to do that quite yet. I did get a new seat, so let's get that installed first. Then we'll get the carb bolted on and reset the calibration. You know, the kit also came with a new needle. We don't really need a new needle, but since we have it, we'll also get that installed. And for removing the seat, I'm going to try using this Tecumseh tool. I'm not sure if it's going to work on a Briggs, but it might. No, it's not really grabbing the seat. I got something that works pretty much every time for that. Let me grab it. And the tool that always works is a properly sized wood screw. You just turn it in just enough to get a couple threads on the inner diameter of that seat. And then you pull it out. Like that. And when you install the seat, just make sure that the smooth side is facing up. The side that has the rib, that faces down against the car body. So you have to be careful when installing it. You know, sometimes this can flip over and you may not notice. In this case, I'm just using a drill bit to push it in place. Like that. I don't think that's any better. So new needle, new seat, kind of the same problem. So maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure on a Briggs, this float, and really on most carbs, this float should be level. Unfortunately, this is not adjustable. So the only other part we can try replacing here is the float. So let me grab a parts carb and we'll try swapping floats. And just for comparison, the parts carb is on the left. The one I just put the new seat in on the right. And you can see it's quite a difference. So we'll swap the floats real quick. And if it's not the float, then I think I'm going to have to order another seat. Unfortunately, I only ordered one. Yeah, same problem. So I must have got a bad seat somehow. But we'll test with what we have. You know, at a minimum, we can get this carb installed. We can get the governor reset. Really, we can get the whole machine together. And we can test it. But it may not run right until we get a good seat into this carb. So to calibrate the governor, it's a very fine adjustment. If you get it even a little bit wrong, then the internal governor, it's not going to be able to slow the engine down. So the first thing you want to do is identify what is idle and what is wide open throttle. In this case, the idle set screw is right there and it pokes through on the other side. So if I rotate this throttle counterclockwise, it goes against the idle set screw. But to do the calibration, you want to be in wide open throttle, which means you rotate that to the right. And another good sign is the spring, because the spring also pulls everything in wide open throttle. So you want to hold the throttle and the arm in that position. And also take note when you're going from idle to full throttle, you know, which way does the shaft rotate? You know, in this case, when you go to wide open throttle, the shaft rotates counterclockwise. So when you hold this in the wide open throttle position, you want to also rotate that shaft counterclockwise until it stops and then lock things down. That should do it. Tank is pretty much spotless, no fuel and no smell of fuel. So I'm going to just take a second. You know, this label doesn't really apply to this machine, so I'm going to heat it up and just peel it off. Well, that is theoretically it. This engine should run, you know, assuming the carb is capable. So I am going to leave the airbox off for now. I do want to do a quick test before committing and getting the fan reinstalled. So I am going to get this back on the frame. We will bolt it down, add a bit of fuel, and we'll try to start it. It's taking a fair amount of fuel, so it might flood over in a second. Yep, we're flooding over. So yeah, the carb, it has issues. Needle and seat definitely need to be replaced. That said, though, I'm leaning towards just replacing the whole carb because I was just turning the choke off. You know, we're not going to need it since we have plenty of fuel in the throat. And I just noticed the detent, or actually it's a little spring back there, is just bent out of shape. So the choke is just kind of flapping in the breeze, which is no good. So yeah, I think we're going to replace the carb, but for now, let's give it a couple pulls and hopefully it starts. Now, the flywheel, I don't know if it's a lightweight flywheel. Potentially this engine may not run without the blower fan installed, but we'll give it a few pulls, and if it looks like it's going to start, then we will run it. All right, we'll turn the ignition on, leave it on low speed, and the choke is open. Okay, good. No surprises. The engine started right up. It sounds good. And the carb, despite its issues, actually ran the engine pretty well. So I think it is worth trying to fix the seat problem. So I did order a new one up. We'll give that a go when it arrives. And when we have it off next, we'll also see if we can improve the choke to get it to lock in a little bit better. For now, though, let's spin this thing around and we'll get the fan reinstalled. So this collar, it does not rely on a bolt for the crankshaft. It's actually a tapered fit. So as you tighten these bolts and it draws the collar to the fan, you know, it pinches it onto the crankshaft, locking it in place. Anyway, there is a key. It stayed in the collar. So I'm going to try to get this installed, I'm going to say with the key in the collar. And when installing this, the fan needs to be almost touching the back, you know, no further than a 1/4 inch away. You do have to go around this a few times because as I tighten these up, the collar is getting pulled in a bit. So you just got to keep doing it until the bolts no longer turn. think that's good. And the throttle cable is one item I decided to not replace. The OEM part was $55. So this one is a little melted there on the outside. But that is just a plastic coating. There's actually a metal sleeve underneath. And that's fine. So functionally, this cable is 100%. Handle's been resecured, and I did tighten all these bolts, so everything is nice and tight. The cable's been reattached and calibrated, so we do get full range of operation on that throttle. The fan is all set, and I refueled the carb, and surprisingly, the needle shut off, and it's holding steady right there. So let's give it another try now that we have mostly everything sorted out. Ignition's on, choke's on. I think we're looking pretty good. Besides the couple issues we have with the carb, the rest of the machine, I think, is pretty much done. So the new seat, it'll be here tomorrow. So when it arrives, we'll get it installed and finish this up. This time around, I went with some aftermarket seats. They were dirt cheap, and we have a whole bunch of them. So, the OEM attempt failed. I think that OEM kit was probably about $9. And we only had one seat and one needle. You know, this kit I think was a little less. And I'm actually not sure how many it came with, but from looking at the bag, I'd say close to 20. And same exact procedure as last time. Pretty much the same thing. So, yeah, this one's odd. There's really nothing more we can do. You know, I don't think it's right. But short of buying a new carb, you know, I don't think there's any adjustments we can do to this one other than replace the seat, which we've done twice now. So I think I'm going to call this one good enough. We're just going to have to use the blower and see how it runs. So we'll get the bowl back on. And I also want to try to fix the choke. The detent that holds it in place isn't actually making contact. And the last time I had it running, actually, the choke didn't seem to bounce around from the vibration of the engine. So it may not be that critical. But right now, the spring is not making contact with the choke lever at all. So I'm thinking, you know, let's get the plate out. We can slide this entire mechanism out. And then we can try to bend the spring back. You know, worst case, it doesn't do anything. Or I guess worst case, it breaks off. You know, either way, it's not doing anything now. So, you know, all we can do is make it better. That might do it. Yep. So the spring, it's now engaging the detent. So yeah, pulling the carb off wasn't a complete waste. At least we made one fix. So we'll get the plate back in. And make sure it's centered up or else the choke won't close all the way. So good. Let's get this back on. We'll get the airbox on and call it done. Just going to test the new seat real quick. Make sure it shuts the fuel off instead of flooding. And I think we're good. Fuel flow stopped advancing. So let's get the tank connected and get the airbox on. So let's give this thing a quick try. It is well past leaf season, and it's actually due to snow tomorrow. So I think today is the day we give this thing a try. That said, though, there are still plenty of leaves to clean up, and I can actually hear a leaf blower in my neighbor's yard running right now. So yeah, leaf season, it's never quite over until it's over. So let's get this thing fired up. Hopefully there's no surprises and no fires. Yeah, gotta love those push blowers. They make very quick work clearing leaves. Anyway, this was about 5 minutes of work to get it to the point where it is now. And although technically leaf season is well over, it's never really over until the springtime comes, because there are still leaves kind of clinging to the branches, and those can take months to fully come down. Anyway, as far as the machine goes, no issues to report. It started first pull, engine sounded good, and ran without issue. Now, when I started this project, I did say that free things are usually the most expensive. And it's a good thing this one was free, because fixing it was not cheap. If I had chosen to use OEM parts, we were looking at over $300. But thankfully, I was able to source some used and some aftermarket parts, making this repair at just over $100. As far as the damage goes, it was a lot more extensive than I thought. And really, I was giving the owner the benefit of the doubt. I thought maybe he spilled a little bit of gas and the kill wire on the primary may have sparked the fire. But as we got into it, we saw that was not the case. That head gasket was obliterated. I had never seen anything like it. And what I'm assuming happened was that, likely the carb was clogged, the engine wouldn't start, and excessive amounts of ether was fed into the engine, causing a detonation. It blew out the head gasket and likely sprayed out a bunch of ether all over everything on fire. And that's what caused the damage that we saw. Anyway, at the end of the day, we got this thing back to where it should be, and it's running quite well. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.